Welcome to Professor Russell Esposito's channel on information security. This video is just one of many video modules that are part of Professor Esposito's course on the subject. Video modules for his entire information security course are located on this channel. So remember to hit the like button as well as subscribe if you enjoy the video. Thank you for watching.
Module 9, Malware, Vulnerabilities, and Threats. This lesson is broken down into 4 categories of malware, threats and vulnerabilities, application threats specifically, and password attacks. But before we look at those, we'll look at a few websites just to show you that there are some websites that show live real-time statistics on attacks. There are several websites that provide online maps and listings and some charting of attacks that are happening in real time. The first one, Kaspersky, is a Russian antivirus, anti-malware company, very, very good, located in Moscow. Interesting story about Kaspersky is they were, even though they were a Russian company with some say ties to Putin because they're located in Moscow, they were providing antivirus and malware software protection for all of our federal agencies. Quite ironic, but at any rate, the Trump administration removed them, created a bit of a stir with the State Department, who had a long-term relationship with Kaspersky, removed them from the federal agencies, and they are now using American software companies. But at any rate, if you look at their website, you'll see that there are several rectangular buttons on the bottom. If you hover over the button, it'll tell you the kind of attack it is at a high level, just give you the name of it. And you can turn those buttons on and off if it's too busy, but it'll scroll across the screen, building up all of the volume of attacks. The next one, FireEye, is interesting because FireEye will show attacks sort of aggregated, not individually counting them. But what's interesting is they'll show you when an APT, an advanced persistent threat, occurs. It'll sort of flash when it hits the country in question. And APTs are interesting because they're prolonged targeted attacks. And what the concept here is they're usually nation states, or very sophisticated hackers hired by nation states. And the concept here is not to disturb anything, not to create any alarm, not to destroy any files. They're not looking for ransomware. They're looking to steal your technology, your customers, your information about your company, military information, obviously military technology. And they sit there quietly, very low in the system. These APTs, sometimes at the root level, very hard to detect before even your operating system fully executes. And the idea is to just quietly steal information. And that site, FireEye, the second one listed here, will show you when an APT hits. And the third one is a little bit harder to understand, but IBM has this product called X-Force for all their customers. So by the way, all the statistics on these 3 sites, these are the statistics that are reflected from their customers, their customers that are having attacks, and their software is preventing damage and harm. So Kaspersky is showing their customer activity, FireEye is showing theirs. Similarly, IBM X-Force is showing their customer activity. But IBM lets you put a URL in or a file to check for some damage, and they have a dashboard that it's a little busy looking. You really need to be a customer to understand it, but the idea is they offer a lot of research and information about many, many different types of attacks and where they're happening and how they occur. But so, you don't need to memorize these or anything, just giving these to you for additional information. APTs are an important thing to know about, but these sites are here just for your additional edification. And I would look at the first 3 just to get a sense of how these sites work. Malware. This slide has the first 3. The most common one is adware, which really just requires you to visit a site, and the next thing you know, they're spying on you and they're sending you maybe emails, or Google is the worst. You do some searching on Google, the next thing you'll get is ads the next day on whatever product or service you're looking for. In fact, you should use, becoming very, very popular, DuckDuckGo, DuckDuckGo.com. Very popular search engine. Many people like it because they don't censor information, they don't track you, they don't sell your information, and they also grade other sites that you search on in their search engine. So for example, if you search on google.com, if you go into DuckDuckGo search engine and search on google.com, Google will get a rating of D as in dog because they're the worst in terms of adware. So it gives you a little rating on the sites you're visiting in terms of how much spying they do on you, which is kind of interesting. But DuckDuckGo itself doesn't spy on you, doesn't track you, doesn't sell you data, and it's become very, very popular among many users. Spyware sounds like it could be innocuous, but it can be malicious. It can be tracking your activity. It could be a keylogger, logging all your keystrokes, including your passwords, which would be very dangerous, of course. And spyware sometimes looks for your watering holes, which is a term meaning the sites you like to visit. And we'll find out later on why hackers love to find out what your watering hole is. And then there are standard viruses that usually come in emails. It requires a user to interact somehow, to click on a picture or a link, or do something to activate the virus, which then encrypts your files or renames them, destroys them, however the virus is written, to proceed. This slide reviews a few other types of malware. Worms. Worms are essentially a specialized virus. A virus requires a user, someone who received an email or some file, to do something, to activate it. Worms are not like that. Worms, once they penetrate into your system, they can activate themselves and replicate themselves. They do not require any user interaction to trigger the executive program to run. Trojans, these are hidden programs. These appear to be friendly programs like a birthday card or a holiday card, but has a malicious program. The concept here is this looks like a joke or something funny or interesting or a nice greeting. It gets passed around from person to person via email. If it's not detected by any antivirus programs and someone decides to click on the picture or the GIF or a file, they're infected, of course. They can delete files, they can change ports, they can change file names, they can do a number of things. It's essentially a virus, but it's introduced to an organization through a hidden mechanism. So we learned about steganography earlier on in the cryptography chapter. So Trojans are really a stenographic technique. Rootkits are installed at a very deep level in your system, the operating system, the kernel level, to avoid detection. Typically APTs will be this way. There'll be rootkits that install very deep in your system. Sometimes they execute before the operating system loads. They can shut off your antivirus, anti-malware, create a lot of damage, obviously, because they're hard to detect. They won't even appear in a Windows Task Manager, when you look to see what's running on your system, because it's running sort of deep into your system at the kernel level. But there are tools to find them and eliminate them, like Microsoft Rootkit Reliever, Kaspersky, and some others that are well known for rootkit detections. But they're sort of dangerous kinds of malwares. Backdoors. You've probably heard of backdoor as a way to get into a system. Sometimes they're there, unintentionally in an application. It's left there. It's an error in the code in the application, or it could be left there by an attack, by a malware attack, and sitting there waiting to be used, for a later, deeper attack when there's more surveillance that's going on and reconnaissance about a company or about their systems. So they may put a backdoor in there. A hacker may put a backdoor and wait for the right time to enter that backdoor and create havoc. Or it could be, unintentional, something that's a problem in the system, in the application code. It could also be intentionally put there. It could be there by sometimes software vendors intentionally create backdoors that are hidden for accessing a crashed system. When a customer calls and they can't access their system, if the vendor has no way of accessing the application through the normal methods, they'll have a backdoor for them for the vendor to debug what the problem is. So backdoors are exactly what they sound like, and they end up in applications by a number of mechanisms. You probably heard of ransomware. Ransomware, very, very common, very much a growing problem. And the concept here is to infect an organization, a company, and actually in the last several years, hackers have been targeting hospitals, municipalities, and smaller community banks. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide, because hospitals and municipalities and school districts also, they don't have the same rigor that a large bank or a large organization might have, or a large health system, or a large insurance company. So essentially, they'll attack. They'll usually enter through. This has happened to me twice as when I was a chief information officer. Twice I had ransomware attacks in our organization, and it's, the typical, somebody opens up a file that misunderstood the email. It was a phishing attack. It included some ransomware. The next thing you know, the ransomware is encrypting files and displaying messages. To get the de-encryption key, you have to make a payment in Bitcoin, and they tell you how to buy Bitcoin, how to pay. And we had one that was very polite, that said, when you make payment with Bitcoin, please be patient while we process your order, and they'll, presumably give you the key to de-encrypt your files. In neither case did we pay the attacker. We were able to work with backups and just get rid of, isolate and stop the ransomware attack. And the files that were encrypted, we just deleted them and used backup files, and we lost a little work during the day, but we didn't want to pay the attacker. So polymorphic malware is a little different. Of course, a lot of these there could be combinations of these, right? But this is another technique. It changes every time it's installed, the polymorphic malware, so that the antivirus signatures or AV signatures from antivirus companies can't detect it, because it's looking for the characteristics, how many bits it is, how it works, what port it uses. It'll look for, things that are basically its signature. But if it changes enough, pieces of information about it, it may prevent an antivirus software from detecting it. So it's not really changing the code itself and what it does, but the things that are around it, the way it's encrypted. Maybe it uses a different encryption technology or a different algorithm. So it's a way to sort of to disguise itself each time it's installed, so it looks a little different. There's also heuristic antivirus software that might detect it. The problem with heuristic antivirus software is sometimes you get false positives where it thinks it's detecting a virus which doesn't exist. But it's improving, sort of as artificial intelligence and business machine learning becomes more part of cybersecurity. These things will become more accurate, more sophisticated. Then there are armored viruses that have encryption. They'll also have sort of additional code, useless code, just obfuscation. It might run something that doesn't really have anything to do with the attack. It's just executing something to deflect and make it difficult to reverse engineer and disassemble the virus to understand what it's doing. So it just takes longer to, for an antivirus company or anyone else to try to understand what this virus is doing, because it's encrypted and has all this obfuscation. So it's a way to just make the virus more difficult to comprehend in terms of its functionality, and that's called an armored virus. And then, of course, there are combinations of these. You could be polymorphic and armored. So these are just different techniques. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. They're techniques that are used in combination often. A few more interesting malware: a logic bomb, which has a trigger to go off based on a certain date or a date and time or some system activity. A file gets backed up, or it gets or a database gets reorganized. Something triggers it, and it's sometimes it's put there by an insider or a disgruntled employee. They leave the company, they leave a logic bomb. 3 months, 2 months, 6 months after they're gone, the logic bomb hits some backup that was scheduled or some activity that the insider, particularly an IT insider, would know, and the logic bomb goes off. So the culprit is long gone from the organization. And then there are rats, remote access tools. Sometimes these are called remote access Trojans because they're often delivered in a Trojan. But a remote access tool or Trojan essentially does what it sounds like it does. It's trying to, from a remote position over the internet, obviously, control your system. And sometimes APTs are rats, and sometimes they're not, but they're often combined. As I said earlier, these are different techniques that are often used in combination. They can steal information, they can rename files, encrypt them, delete files, delete databases, and they're very dangerous, obviously. But, an APT is not looking to create a problem. The APT that may be a rat is not looking to rename, encrypt, or delete files and create an issue. They want to stay hidden. APTs, advanced persistent threats, the P is important. That's the operative word here. They're persistent. So they want to steal technology. They want to steal data and files and information. That kind of a rat, remote access tool, if that's an APT version, they're looking to quietly steal your technology, military secrets, other technology secrets, big pharma technology, and just remotely operate in the dark, so to speak, without being detected. In the chapter or module on network fundamentals, we learned about ping. There was a video on that. It uses the ICMP, Internet Control Message Protocol. And the ping is really just a way to see if a system is up and running. Are you there? Are you there? Because sometimes, if you can't access a system, you're not sure, is the system even up? Is this website up? Is this web server running? Or is it something with your ISP, getting there, the traffic or some difficulty getting to that location or that destination, that URL. So a ping is a good way to just see how fast you can get there and if it's up and running. And it could be used, as we said earlier, in the network fundamentals when we explained ping. We explained how you can get a ping of death or denial of service by overloading a system with pings. And a distributed denial of service is when you're using bots. And we'll look at bots in a couple of slides going forward, how they work, but I think you may have an understanding already of that. A Smurf attack is like the reverse of a ping. It uses a ping to upset a system, but really what's happening is the reply from the ping, are you up? The ping asks the system. The reply goes to the victim. So now the victim is not really hampered by the ping itself, but the victim is hampered by the reply. So the IP address of the hacker is spoofed, and it's replaced by whoever their intended victim is. So all these pings are damaging some site that's receiving the ping, and then all the replies that go back, that should go back to the hacker, go back to their victim because they've spoofed the IP address. So a Smurf attack is like a ping attack, but it's the reply that's flooding the victim's host machine. So botnets deliver malicious code, or they could be just pinging, just creating a flood of pings. And really what happens is these botnets infect other machines, PCs, or even the Internet of Things, IoTs. In fact, there was a famous attack on Amazon, I guess around 2018, something like that, where Amazon was brought down by, a distributed denial of service attack of pings. And the pings were coming not from machines or servers or PCs, but mostly from thermostats, the Internet of Things. So a botnet infects these thermostats, these PCs, and they go on and deliver malware, or they create a ping flood and create havoc. And you see there's a sort of a picture here in the sense on the right hand side that sort of shows how a ping attack may happen. And we've talked about pings, so hopefully you have an understanding of how that works. But the botnet is a way of just using many machines or IoTs to help deliver their malware or their ping of death. Transitive attacks. So transitive attacks occurs among machines, usually network devices, routers or switches, and there's security in these devices. And they have what's called a trust set up, a security trust between these devices. And if you have a machine A trust machine B and machine B trust machine C, you should never be able to get from machine A to machine C, because machine A has no machine, a device, a router, a switch. Machine A has no trust with machine C. But if there's a flaw in the way the security is configured, you could potentially get from device A to device C, even though that should never happen. Because A trusts B and B trusts C, but there's no trust between A and C. But that's a transitive attack is what that's called. And it's usually a flaw in the way the security is configured among these devices on the network. Most firewalls and virtual LANs, VLANs can stop this, detect this, and won't allow this breach in the trust. But sometimes you're outsourcing, a company's outsourcing to a third-party business, and these business partners could potentially have the same problem that can allow, if they have access to a network, allow this kind of jumping from a device A to device C, let's say, and that should never happen, but it allows penetration, beyond, some access control list, or, heaven forbid, behind the firewall or something like that. And the next item on this slide is ARP spoofing. So in Module 4, we talked about network fundamentals. We explained how the ARP table, or the ARP table in the Address Resolution Protocol, ARP, has a table that maps IP addresses to MAC addresses. You know, they fingerprint the social security number for your machine, telephone, switches, everything has a MAC address, if you remember. And what spoofing does, it redirects traffic. So ARP spoofing, and there's a picture on the next slide to help you understand this, is that what a hacker does is it gets into that ARP table and spoofs it, changes it, so that the IP address coming back, the response from the internet that should be directed to a particular machine, that IP address is mapped to a machine's address, the MAC address. The hacker changes that MAC address and inserts his or her MAC address. So the table is spoofed, and now the reply, instead of going back to the intended recipient, goes to the hacker. So you know, you can, and then once the hacker does that, they run Wireshark. They can run, you know, an Ethernet sniffer. Common one is Wireshark, and they can sniff all the traffic and see, you know, what data is in the traffic and potentially pick up passwords. And these are sort of a type of man-in-the-middle attack. Let's look at the next slide, and you can see a picture of ARP spoofing. Here's a picture of ARP spoofing or ARP poisoning. So Bob on the left is IP address 10001, MAC address all B's. He's trying to communicate with Alice to the right. Her IP address is 1007, and her Mac machine address is all A's. What the hacker does is change the ARP table, the vertical line going up to the switch. So when Bob tries to communicate with Alice, he's trying to send something to machine, and again, they're using IP addressing to do this, right? In the ARP table, this is a switch, is really a switch acting like a router. A level 2 switch works like a router. Not important, but they probably should have put a router in this picture. But 10.0.0.0.7 should go to, really should be assigned, that IP address is assigned to Alice on the right with all her A's. But you could see in this diagonal going from Bob to the attacker, the MAC address is spoofed in the ARP cache or the ARP table, and it's going to machine CCCC. It's going to the attacker. You know, and similarly, when Alice is sending information to Bob, IP address 10001, that's the diagonal on the right-hand side, it's also being deflected to the attacker, to his MAC address. So essentially, he's replacing the attacker is replacing the proper MAC address that's associated with the IP address, and he's replacing that with his or her MAC address, so he can get the traffic. So this is, you know, typical man-in-the-middle attack through ARP spoofing or poisoning. Phishing, one of the most common kinds of attacks. So here's a little Dilbert cartoon, and Dogbert tells Dilbert, I have a new hobby. It's called phishing. I send fake banking emails to gullible executives, and then I find out their financial information and use it to steal the money they don't deserve. And there's that boss, the executive, who's reading the phishing email, and it says here, this is your bank. If you forgot your social security number and password, why don't you send them to us so we can protect your money? Sincerely, IB Banker. And the executive goes, yeah, it looks legit. That's their boss that they're always in contention with. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dilbert or not. So phishing looks like it's a bogus email, but it's supposed to look like it's a legitimate email from a bank or from Amazon or from some place that that people commonly use. Of course, these emails will go to, you know, thousands and thousands of people, and some may say, I've never shopped at Amazon, or I haven't shopped at Amazon for months, and they'll immediately realize. But if you've had the activity with this particular bank or this site, you'll probably read it, and they'll put some sort of sense of importance or urgency in it, and they'll make it look just like the site, whether it's PayPal or a bank. And there'll be a link to click on. And I'm going to show you an example of this in the next slide, but the hint here, or the advice, is hover over the link, but don't click on it. And if you hover over it with your mouse, it'll display the hacker's real URL, which is usually going to look odd and bogus. And I'll have an example of that in the next slide so you get a better picture of what I'm talking about. So that's phishing. Phishing with a V is phishing over the phone. It's usually more done for social engineering, to get information. What hackers do, reconnaissance. They're trying to learn more about a company or about their IT department, how they function or how their network works, and, you know, the information about the company. they'll call up and they'll pretend they work in the company, another department, or they may call up and pretend they're IT. In a large company with a lot of divisions and subsidiaries, people can be confused, or a new employee could give out information that they really shouldn't give out. And that social engineering is a very big part of the early phase of a large attack, which is, this reconnaissance, collecting information. And, sophisticated hackers could call and make the caller ID look as if it's coming from, the person they're pretending to be, whether it's the IT department within the company, or if they're calling pretending they're from a bank. The caller ID could potentially say a bank's name, like Wells Fargo. So that's what phishing is. It's more of a technique for social engineering to collect information during that whole reconnaissance, that early phase of a large, sophisticated attack. Spear phishing is like phishing, but it's intended for specific individuals. They've already collected some information, maybe through phishing or through some other social engineering, and they know some key people, maybe in IT or in finance, and they want to phish them specifically. And that's called spear phishing, because they're not sending out emails to thousands of people blindly hoping they hit a gullible person. They have a targeted individual in mind. That's spear phishing. When spear phishing is targeted at a senior executive, like a chief executive officer, CEO, or CFO, chief financial officer, that's called whaling, because now they're phishing, for a large fish. The next slide, we'll go back to phishing, and we'll look at an example of a phishing email. So this is a good example of a phishing email. It's supposed to look like it's coming from Amazon, but if you look at the from address, Amazon spelled a little differently, and it's like Amazon Canada, which might be a little unusual if you're in the United States. Maybe it's more credible if you're living in Canada, but it's still not spelled right. And there is no, if you try to go to that site, you'll find out, and again, it's not spelled right, you'll find that it's not really it may not even be accessible from the public. So that's number one. Number two, it says Dear Client. It doesn't have your name. It's not saying specifically addressing the customer. It doesn't know who you are because it's a phishing attack. And then the thing I wanted to sort of explain is that little red arrow that says hovering over the link reveals it points to a non-Amazon site. HTTP redirect, .com, etc.com. So don't click on it, but if you hover over it, you'll either see on the, close to your mouse, cursor, or at the bottom of your browser, you'll see the actual address, and it'll be more apparent that there's a phishing attack. And if you're not sure, the other good suggestion is, if you think this really comes from Amazon and it's telling you to log on, it's urgent, you please, the next 36 hours, verify something, don't click on the email. Go to your URL, open a tab, and type in amazon.com and log on and check there and see if there's any messaging or anything that looks peculiar to you. So, or a bank's email or messaging, or call your bank, if it's so the idea is to not log on from the link unless you're absolutely certain this link is good, because you've hovered over it and you can determine it, and the email from address looks proper. But you can see here in the from address, it says management at Amazon. There is no A for Amazon. There's just the at sign instead of the letter A. So again, these little subtle things that people need to look for, and if they're busy at work, they're not paying attention, and then they can easily fall for when thousands of these go out. There are products now that vendors sell that right in your email system, you have all the options, reply, send, forward. They can add a little add-on button that says, I think this is a phishing attack. And that email goes right to IT for them to examine. And sometimes IT tests, the IT department for a company will send out their own phishing emails to see which employees will fall for a phishing attack, and they need to be re-educated, need to take a course, a little online course on phishing, because they clicked on something that could have been an attack, but the internal IT department sent that out to employees. And they'll do that. They'll sample employees 10, 20, 30 every quarter periodically, and just see if how tuned in the employees are to identifying a phishing attack. And if they have a product that's embedded and as an add-on to their email system, the employee will click on that box, and if it came from IT, it'll say, congratulations, you've identified a phishing attack that was sent you, internally from IT, you've properly identified it. If it is a real phishing attack, you click on that box, this little function in your email system, and it'll forward it to IT and say, thank you for forwarding this suspicious email to us. So companies are getting more sophisticated in terms of, helping to stop these phishing attacks. Spam. So this fella here is looking at his computer, because this is probably an old cartoon looking at the size of his monitor, right? It says, and 847 emails asking me to support anti-spam legislation. It's kind of ironic, right? But spam can be launched as a distributed denial of service attack. Again, using botnets to send out, thousands or millions of emails to crash a server. And incidentally, most email is spam, about 80% of it, and it's blocked by email services pretty well today. Without that blocking, we probably couldn't get to our emails. There'd be so much spam. So fortunately, that technology is containing this problem. So sometimes you get email that looks like spam, just unsolicited email, but it could be, more nefarious than that. It could contain a virus or, a picture or a link somewhere that you might be able to click on where you think it's just an advertisement. So it's a little different than a phishing attack that's making you think that your bank or Amazon or some vendor, some e-commerce vendor that's large that most, millions of people use, they're trying to get you to log on with the spam, with the phishing attack. But spam is a little bit different. It looks like an ad, but it's not. It's got some malware. So again, it's sort of a gray area that they overlap a little bit the way phishing attacks occur. It could be a spam version of a phishing attack. Stopping spam. So there are blacklists that obviously there are many products that you can buy that, email servers like Yahoo Mail or Google Mail, obviously they have these embedded. But if you're running your own email server, if you have an in-house, on-premises email system from Microsoft or from someone else, you really need to, have a third party. It's usually Barracuda is very popular, a cloud service spam detecting system. And they'll blacklist many, sources that they're aware of. Sometimes they stop mail that you want, and you have to override that with a whitelist exception. And there's also Bayesian filters. We had a problem. One of my customers, they were continually, their CFO and their CEO were getting spam emails. Sorry, they're not really spam emails. They were like a spam, but they're really phishing attacks, saying that the CFO wants the CEO to transfer funds. It got so bad that we literally stopped any email and put it in a spam folder to look at and review later if it had the word fund transfer or transfer funds, because they said, look, we're not going to just do this through an email. If we're transferring funds, we'll be talking to each other. We'll know about it long in advance. It's not going to be instructed to us through an email. So there's blacklists, there's Bayesian filters as well. And there's sort of whitelists that can override large blacklists that capture broad strokes of the internet. You might want to whitelist you might have to whitelist some sources to override what's happening in the spam filtering. The other attack that's a vulnerability to a system or a network is session hijacking, or what they call replay attacks. So a hacker gets to sniff a network with Wireshark or some kind of Ethernet sniffer, and they're looking at all the traffic. They can capture data packets, change them, and put them back on the network. And they may appear as, they may function as legitimate packets in the victim's network. This is often stopped by what's called HMAC. If you remember or refer to the cryptography module, we talked about HMAC hashing. And hashing using an HMAC algorithm can really help authenticate where this packet came from and detect when something's been hijacked. And if you remember, HMAC can provide authentication, identifying the true source of where this packet came from, as well as data integrity checks by hashing the contents of the data packet, which is then rehashed by the recipient, and they need to match, or the recipient would know that there's some data integrity issue, some packet damage or loss, or some data integrity issue, and the packet has to be resent. The next item on the screen is DNS poisoning. So if you recall, the domain name server, that whole function, when you type in the Bank of New York, the DNS server looks up the IP address to route you to the right web server. Well, if a hacker is able to get into the DNS table or systems and change the destination, when you type in the Bank of New York, that IP address would then be replaced, the legitimate IP address would be replaced with the hacker's IP address. And then you would be directed to the hacker's website instead of the real bank, and they'll present a website that looks very much like the Bank of New York or Bank of America or whatever, Amazon or Walmart, wherever you're going. And then you go to log on, and voila, the hacker catches your password and ID. So what a hacker will do is when they could just poison a DNS and wait for people to hit that record that now has the hacker's IP address associated with the URL name. But when they combine it with phishing, large-scale emails, it's called farming, because now they're sending out thousands of emails like a phishing attack. But when these thousands of recipients get these emails, if they click on it, or they think they're going to, or they can type in their browser, bankofnewyork.com, it'll be directed to the hacker site. And I'll show you a picture on the next slide here. So here's a graphic of farming, right? A combination of phishing and DNS poisoning. So the attacker here in the top left, step 1, poisons the DNS server on the left and replaces the proper IP address in the DNS server with his fake web server. So now when someone, the bottom, the user, step 2, types in Amazon.com, they go to the DNS server, it comes back with the wrong IP address, and instead of going to Amazon on the right-hand side, the correct site, you see the big X there, the big red X on top of the blue arrow, they're not directed to the proper site, they're directed to step 4, Amuzone, the incorrect website, which will appear, the fake website will look like Amazon, it'll have all the right graphics, the person will go to log on, and if they don't realize they're at a different URL, amuzon.com, because they typed in Amazon properly, but they got directed to this fake site, they then log on with their ID and password, and the hacker collects all that information. So this is a good example of farming, which is a combination of phishing and DNS poisoning.
Crosssite scripting. And again, this occurs because there's a weakness in the application in a website. So the first step is the hacker identifies a website where he or she can input malicious code and store it on that website so that future visitors become infected. A visitor in step 2 visits the site, triggers the malware that's been stored on the site, and that runs some script on the victim's browser and collects credentials, session IDs, cookies, other information sent to the hacker. The hacker essentially performs session hijack and can impact the victim's bank account or whatever this site is. Sometimes these sites are identified as quote-unquote watering holes. A common, if a earlier attack did some reconnaissance from usually some spyware to look on the browser and see what are the common sites that this intended victim visits. This watering hole where it's a delicatessen or a diner or some food chain where they order food regularly, and they infect that site knowing that that person will visit there. But this is a persistent cross-site script, because anyone who goes to that site will be infected, not just this victim. So that's how cross-site scripting works, and it's really caused by a weakness in the application. Cross-site scripting, non-persistent. It's a little bit different. In this case, the attacker is not infecting another site that the victim visits, but the hacker identifies, and if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, the hacker is identifying a site that has weak input validation. So once that's identified, the hacker can create a phishing email with some sense of urgency or importance, and this email is sent to the victim, and that phishing email will have an icon of the bank or some sort of link, and if he clicks on it, that link will take him to the bank, but will also execute a script that follows the URL. So if you look at the bottom of the screen here, you'll see an example of it, bank.com, and then a script, and the hacker knows that bank won't reject it. When the victim clicks on this link in this phishing email, it'll be taken to this trusted site at the bank. It won't be rejected, and the script will run in the input field because there's weak validation in the input field. It'll run in the bank's server. Now the person logs on, thinks everything's fine. They're at a legitimate site, but when they log on, since this script is running in the background after they because they visited the site, and the script is after the URL, following the URL bank.com, the script is going to run in the browser of the victim and send their cookies, their login information, their credentials, their session ID to the attacker. So sometimes this is called reflected cross-site scripting also, because everything looks normal to the victim. They're at the right site. They logged on, everything's normal, but in the background, their personal information, session ID, token, login credentials are being sent to the hacker, who can then obviously do some damage to the person's account. Cross-site request forgery attack. This is a bit different than the cross-site infections. What happens here is a person logs on to a bank or a trusted site, and they finish doing their work, and they're distracted by an email that pops up. Well, maybe they just close the tab, but they don't log off. If you close a browser tab, you're not really logging off. Your session ID, your credentials are still cached in your system. So now eventually the bank or the site you visited will log you off automatically for inactivity, but that might take 10 minutes. So in that 10-minute period, when the person is distracted by an email or something else that is going to create a problem for them, the credentials are active. The bank has not logged them off for inactivity yet. So now they click on some email from a friend or from a phishing email from an attacker. They look at this, they click on something, an image or a link, and at that point, this malware is looking through the person's browser and collecting all that information, the logon credentials, and sending it to the hacker. So it's important when you're online with a bank or an important site to log off, because if you just ignore it and do something else, like look at an email that's infected, your credentials are live on your system and can be stolen. So that's really what a cross-site request forgery is, because it's called forgery because now the hacker has all the credentials and can log on to the person's bank account or whatever this site is, social media, and make changes and create some damage. So that's cross-site request forgery attack. How does one protect from these kinds of attacks? So the first half of this slide talks about protecting against cross-site scripting, non-persistent and persistent. So potential victims need to keep their browsers updated. So that will help protect you from non-persistent problems. Also, be careful on clicking untrusted links or unknown senders, emails from unknown senders. Again, this protects you from non-persistent. And the websites, that are out there that are hosting services, banking services, or social media services, they need to perform, very strong data input validation, as we talked about earlier. They need to try to stop fuzzing, stop, stop attackers from entering scripts into their input fields, whether it's a search field or an ID or a password field or a comment field. The input validation is critically important to edit and filter on that. So they also have to have, and that's for non-persistent, but for persistent cross-site scripting attacks, the website needs to have comprehensive code security testing, whether they do it internally or they have a third party do it, or have something like Veracode, 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 review that code. They need to ensure that that code is not vulnerable so that someone can't permanently store some malware on their site. So this protects you from persistent cross-site scripting. And then as far as the cross-site request forgery, be sure to log off. As I said earlier in the earlier slide, don't just close a tab because your credentials are still active for 10 minutes, 15 minutes until the bank logs you off for inactivity. And the websites, the banks, the social media sites, they need to use what's called encrypted token pattern, which is a defense mechanism that'll stop someone from a different location, from a different browser. Essentially, it tracks the browser that the credentials have been associated with. So if someone steals your credentials and they want essentially they want to forge your logon, they want to log on as you in this forgery attack, the system, the server, the web server will know that this request to log on came from a different browser. So there's association between the login credentials and the specific browser of the visitor. So if someone steals those credentials, they won't work on a different browser. session. Memory buffer overflow, another weakness in an application. This allows an attacker to send much more data than the system can handle, again, in an input field, so that the system overflows, the buffer overflows, the memory overflows, and the data gets spilled into another adjacent memory area. And that's where the hacker can steal this adjacent memory. And there could be other information in there as well, not just the information that's spilled over. So the memory buffer overflow is a way to penetrate a system and essentially steal data from an adjacent memory. So that's just memory buffer overflow. Too much data input that the system cannot handle. So it's an application problem. It's a weakness in the application. Integer data overflow is a little bit different, and this happens when an attacker submits so many digital integers, numbers, that overflows a system. And what happens here generally is it can crash the system, which would then display critical system information, or maybe even provide remote access when the system crashes. So again, depending on how the application is written, the application has to be constructed in a way that can crash. That doesn't really crash. It sort of handles the error properly and doesn't really crash. So these are, whether it's a memory buffer overflow that just exceeds the memory allocation in the application, or integer data overflow that causes the system to crash and provides other information to the hacker, or perhaps remote access. These need to be handled with the last paragraph here. The mitigation is by improving the input validation so that you cannot enter more data or improper data into input field, and have the address space randomization for the memory, so the memory is not abused or overflow, or there isn't an overflow. So these are the kinds of application errors that can cause hackers to have access to your system. SQL code injections. So these are code injections into a system. Again, it's an input field, and these SQL code injections will often have these characters like quote, 1 = 1 quote, or quote equal quote. So that's a trigger. When you see something like that, a system needs to edit and stop that input. So an SQL query can display, it really modifies an SQL query. So it's changing a query so that it displays all accounts, passwords, or other information. So it could be an attack for IDs and passwords, or it could just be an attack on any SQL database. In some cases, the system can crash, display information that's useful to the hacker, or remote access is possible. And the XML injections are similar, act in a similar way to collect information. But these are attacks on a database. It could be any kind of database. It could be a domain controller with passwords and IDs, IDs and passwords, or it could just be, a list of customers or some other sensitive information in a database that a hacker wants to steal. Similar to that is an LDAP LDAP injection, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now, LDAP is used to authenticate users on like Active Directory. When you log on, put in your ID and password, any sort of domain controller. But in this case, it's a targeted attack to collect IDs and passwords. So it's similar, but it's specific for IDs and passwords. And again, in either case, there's a problem with the application that's allowing these code injections to occur. So the mitigation is stripping out any unintended code or characters and before it can get passed to a database, and certainly stripping out editing for the characters that are on the first sentence here, 1 = 1, or just the equal sign in quotes, so that because those are clues that there's an SQL injection embedded in this query that's coming. So it's really better error handling code also when there's an error. Sometimes these injections cause errors, and the system might, again, whenever a system doesn't handle an error properly, it could display critical information, that the hacker can take advantage of, or the system can crash, and again display information that's useful. So it's a question of, again, ensuring that your application strips out any of these kinds of scripts or injections before the database is reached, and ensuring that if there's an error as a result of the script, that it's handled properly, and that an error is displayed and the system does something that that isn't unanticipated or unexpected. So you sort of have to think ahead with these applications, and consider different sorts of conditions that might cause errors and handle them gracefully so that you don't crash or display information that's sensitive to your organization. or about your systems. Privileged escalation, administrator access, or root access. So this is when there's some weakness or vulnerability in a system, whether it's part of the application or part of an input field, or some software bug, design flaw that allows a hacker to access the system as an administrator at the root access. So obviously this is very dangerous because the hacker has total control of the server at that point. They can destroy things, change things, that they're essentially the administrator. So the remediation is stop input fuzzing, make sure your input fields can edit and stop hackers from putting in too much data or scripts, remediate insecure files, employ address space randomization. This prevents memory buffer overflows that we saw earlier. Repair DLL preloading vulnerabilities. These are all sort of weaknesses in an application that can allow a hacker to get total access to your system, which is very dangerous, obviously, and needs to be remediated immediately. Okay, cookies and flash cookies. These kinds of cookies are never deleted from your browser. So, this uses browser history, the sites you frequently visit, and these are watering holes, right? This is a site. If somebody's targeting you and they can't really access your server or your system, they look for a watering hole, a place you go to frequently to attack with a Crosssite script, as we saw in the earlier slide. So these cookies and flash cookies, again, they have a nice history of what you're doing, and there could be other information in some of these cookies, and then they're never deleted unless you manually delete them. So it creates a bit of vulnerability that there's some information that a hacker could potentially access on your browser. Password attacks. So how do hackers attack a password? Now we saw earlier you could do an SQL injection or an LDAP injection to access passwords, but really at that point you're just collecting encrypted IDs and passwords. You're not really seeing the IDs, you're not seeing the passwords in the Latin letters we've inherited from the Romans. The Latin letters that's used in most European languages, and in English they can't see that. They're just seeing hashed values that are encrypted. They really can't read them. So, but that's still useful for them. So that's really the first problem there is the rainbow table. Once they collect all that information, they can run it against what's called a rainbow table. And this is sort of a sophisticated brute force attack. They're collecting all of your IDs and passwords, and they're running it against a rainbow table that's got billions, I'm going to repeat that, billions of hashed values from stolen sites. But they have the value here in the rainbow table. They know what the value is. So if they can get the stolen hash to match a hash in the rainbow table, they'll know what the value was that was hashed, the original value, your password and ID. So that's a very sophisticated way to do what's called a brute force attack, because they're using a hacking password cracking tool. In the bottom of the screen, I list a few of the common ones. A password cracking tool that will then create this dynamic of comparing the stolen hashes to the rainbow table hashes to identify the original value that was hashed, so a hacker can log on. There's also sort of a more simpler brute force attack where a hacker might be doing shoulder surfing, where they're in social engineering, they're looking over your shoulder, they're seeing, or they're talking, and little by little they're catching your password in pieces, and they may not have the complete password, but they have it pretty close, and they can try to log on, guessing a few of the last characters if they're not sure exactly what you typed. But it's not as sophisticated, but it's another way to get in. And certainly, if you fail too many times, you'll be locked out, but then you could try again the next day, and it's sort of a more primitive version of that. Dictionary attacks are when hackers also have dictionaries of common words and common phrases that are also stored in a rainbow table, in addition to all the stolen and calculated hashes in the rainbow table, and billions of them. All the common words in the English dictionary are phrases like, let this force be with you, or I put here in this third paragraph, season plus year. It's very common that when you do an audit of a company, you'll often find, if it's a large company with a few thousand people, you'll also find that there are a few individuals that are using the season and the year as their password, because they have to change it every 90 days in most cases. So they'll put spring 2022 And then when this fall comes, they'll do fall 2022. And they might put an exclamation point after it. But these dictionary attacks will accommodate both variations, and they can, find this as a common phrase or word, and, again, figure out what the hashed value is from their rainbow table and penetrate your organization that way. Birthday attacks are a phenomenon that happens. When we looked at cryptology, we said that periodically it's rare, but two completely different phrases can create the same hashed value. And that's called a birthday attack. So essentially they find a hash in a rainbow table that matches. But it's possible the person might have typed in, rain, run, and there was a hash value, but another completely different phrase like sun, walk could create the same hash. It's rare, but these hashing algorithms are not perfect. They're not really exactly 100% random in terms of the way they create the hash, because they're created by a mathematical algorithm. So it's really a simulated randomization. And when these two things match, the hashes match, the hacker can log on with a different phrase than the victim, but it creates the same hash and they get into the system. It's called a birthday attack because that statistic, when there's 23 people in a room, there's a 50% chance that 2 people have the same birthday. And of course, if the room contains more people, the percentage goes up. But I think it's 23 people in a room creates a 50% chance that 2 people have the same birthday. So that's why it's called a birthday attack, because it has that same sort of coincidence where 2 things match. And the bottom of this slide shows you a list of some of the password cracking tools that'll use these rainbow tables and dictionaries and try to help that process of matching stolen IDs and passwords that are hashed with the ones that exist in these hacker rainbow tables. There's a website I think you should be aware of called the MITRE attack, or attack matrix, or MITRE attack. There's a 12-minute video on the bottom. You can look at that. I think it gives you a nice little walkthrough of part of how this attack matrix works. So if you look at this, if you look at the original screen that's here, it's everything from the left-hand side, reconnaissance, resource deployment, initial access, all the way to the right-hand side, exfiltration, when they're stealing data or an impact. It looks at the entire chain of events during a hacker's attack and all of the different techniques they use and how to mitigate against them. I think the video skips the reconnaissance, the first several sections, the first several columns here in this picture on the slide, and they cover the other columns to the right. But it gives you a good idea of how it works. So watch those 12 minutes. It's really a database of different kinds of attacks and different portions, different events in the chain of events, from reconnaissance to final execution, and how these attacks work and how to mitigate. So the 12-minute video I think gives you a good idea, but also visit the site if you're interested, attack.mitre.org, which is on the bottom of this slide, so you can play around with it yourself and see how it works. But it's very useful for cybersecurity professionals, so that they can sort of understand what's happening when an attack occurs, and it's just good to give you a good overall concept of the different events as this chain builds up, sort of the which is sometimes called the reverses kill chain. How do you kill this chain, right? How do you kill this chain of events? How do you monitor a system to identify if one of these steps from left to right is occurring in your organization, to interfere and kill that chain of events and stop the attack. This concludes Module 9, Malware, Vulnerabilities, and Threats.